Welcome to Afro-Asia Beats. This is our second to last event in the After the Dragon Asia's, Africa's in New York City series. All of our events will be archived on the Harvard Asia Center's YouTube page, so you can go check out any that you missed there. And if they're not up now, they should be very soon. Our final event, called Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting and Other Martial Arts, will be a conversation between Dr. Miriam Aziz, Dina Asfaha, and Justin Winley about Black self-defense practices, which will be held on December 8th at 7:30 p.m. at Nuyorican Poets Cafe and live streamed on Zoom. So, check that out, mark your calendars. Before we get into the panel, I want to thank our sponsors, Harvard's Asia Center, the Anthropology Department, and the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. And we're very grateful to Tenzin Goda, Julie Story, Chris Paul, Andrew Cepeda, and Mike Holmes for their administrative support. And of course, as always, we are very lucky to have Winston Wong and Brett Ryoji Kodama doing our live streams for the series. I truly think that these are some of the best videos of academic events ever made. And that's really about them. My name is Maya Singhal. I'm a doctoral candidate in the anthropology department at Harvard. And I organized this series along with Veronica Peterson, Rowan Fladd, and Michael Hewitt loosely around my dissertation research, which deals with African American and Chinese American mutual aid, crime, and criminalization in New York City. Anthropologists often talk about community engagement and public anthropology, but can be hard to explain what it is that we actually do in the discipline and how we conduct ethnographic research. To me, the practice of ethnography boils down to engaging and talking with people in the places that they work or live, which brings us here to You and Me Books. So for those of you joining us online, You and Me Books is the first Asian American woman-owned bookstore in New York City, and it's located here in Chinatown. We're super grateful to them for letting us take over their store for this discussion about Black and Asian connections in music and dance. And I think it's a really beautiful space to talk about solidarities in and through cultural connections. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Htet is a Southeast Asian R&B artist born in Myanmar and currently based in New York City. Her music has recently been featured in the Netflix show Indian Matchmaker. Christina Misaki Nikitin is a doctoral student in ethnomusicology at Harvard University, working at the intersections of music studies, performance studies, feminist and queer theories, and post or decolonial thought. Her research examines the politics and aesthetics of musicking and queer underground music scenes in Japan, South Africa, and the United States. Rohan Zhou Lee is a queer, non-binary, or gender firebird, Black and Asian author, dancer, and organizer in New York City. They're the founder of the Blasian March, an initiative to build solidarity between Black, Asian, and Blasian communities through education and celebration. They're also a dancer, trumpeter, and writer of poetry, essays, and Afro-Asian fantasy. So Christina, I was wondering if you could start us off by telling us a little more about your research. It's really interesting to connect Japan and South Africa. So I wonder if you could also say a little bit more about the relationships between these different sites and the music scenes there.
Sure. So I have done field work in both Tokyo, Japan, and Cape Town, South Africa, specifically looking at queer world making through music and performance. Where should I start? So I came to kind of doing research in Cape Town, especially because as someone who grew up in Japan my whole life, although music was an integral part of my life because my parents were musicians, I actually have always felt like music in Japan was overtly apolitical. And I think that actually has to do a lot with like post-war kind of suppression of any kind of like political messaging in culture in general. And then with South Africa, I was really deeply moved by all the kind of anti-apartheid protest music with Miriam Makeba, Hugh Masekela, Abdul Ibrahim, and the like. And so when I started to look into the music and musical cultures of South Africa, I realized as I was grappling with my own queer identity that there wasn't much scholarship on kind of queer musicking or like on queer activism in South Africa. So that's how I kind of came to it. And I'm also kind of doing field work in Japan now, reevaluating what I thought was overtly apolitical as actually being underground more. And so while I'm working with these two, very different regions, it's true that there isn't a lot of migratory kind of patterns in terms of a lot of Japanese people living in South Africa or a lot of South African people living in Japan. So it's very different in terms of kind of what you would imagine, for example, Afro-Asian coalition and music making in the United States, where there is a lot more interaction between kind of the two groups. But what I do notice a lot actually is that because they share this kind of communal Americanized lens of popular discourse, as well as when it comes to queer identity notions of, the LGBTQIA+. These things actually tie together all kinds of cultural exchange and all kinds of conceptions, both good and bad, through kind of a white American medium or lens. And so, for example, in South Africa, there is a lot of kind of cultural imports of Japanese, sometimes stereotypes, sometimes kind of cultural appreciative elements. So, the notion of like the ninja, samurai, these topics come up a lot, especially I would say in like Cape hip hop. And then in Japan, especially in the past few years, I would say there's a lot more popularity rising when it comes to a lot of South African house music. So that would include like Kwaito, or right now, Amapiano, I think was rising since 2019. And so there's all kinds of, interactions going on there. But my kind of research grapples with the question of what does it mean for a truly kind of Afro-Asian coalition-based music to happen, especially if there isn't a dialogic counterpart, because they're not really in dialogue. Or are they? So that's kind of what I'm examining. Yeah.
I love that. I think there's something really interesting about these sort of like sound cultures and the ways that they can like bring us together when we're not like physically present with each other. That was like one of the things I'm super excited about thinking through in this conversation. And I think this sort of touches on a lot of the things that Rohan, you're interested in, because from trumpet to dance to your ethnomusicology degree, which I just found out about when we were promoting this event, you have so many different connections to sound cultures. And I was wondering how you bring these sort of knowledges and experiences to your activism and organizing.
Yeah, of course. Yes, hidden fact, I have a degree in musicology because I don't tell the world. I don't know why. Yeah, I guess for me, it's almost like music is in many ways the unspoken dialogue between our communities. So like thinking a lot about, so with the Blasian March, of course, our mission statement, we talk about building solidarity through education and celebration. And we acknowledge celebration through music. And in this way, like, so in our spaces, we will have Asian performing artists, African diaspora performing artists come through. And this is a way for not only people to just experience the work of these artists, but also learn to appreciate these other communities in a way that is almost outside the colonial lens, outside the white gaze. Because when we are creating a space of protest, we are also trying to build a space that is as free of these gazes as possible. So for me, that looks like, how do we now create or use music to suspend the white gaze? How do we use music to suspend the colonial influence on how we misunderstand each other? That's one way that we do it. The other way is that when we do the march itself. So for folks who don't know, a lot of our protests kind of start with a rally, have our speeches, have performing artists, then we march and go to a giant feast in the park where everyone gets free food and stuff. It's wonderful. And while we march, not only do we have performing artists from different like cultures. So like, for example, our 2021, our 1 year anniversary rally, it was a Black Asian Trans Power rally. And we had Filipino percussion music as we marched. We also had a Filipino kulintang, other percussion ensemble performing as we were marching as well. And I actually brought a musical sound example that I would love to play. Hope it's audible. Let's see. I put it next to the mic, right?
Or you can just next to yours.
Oh, I'm holding. I was like, this whole like, it's a whole bend and snap. But it's actually, it's just placed. Okay, stand by. So this is a musical sample of our 1 year anniversary rally. Oh, wait, hang on. Starting over. She was muted. Asian power, Black Asian justice, Black Asian freedom, justice for Asians, justice for Black people, justice for Asians. That was shot and captured by Ramon Rodriguez, one of our videographers. But something I also kind of noticed where my I guess my musicology brain comes into play. So yeah, I have a classical background. I was raised listening to a lot of Chinese symphonic classical orchestral music, as well as Black composition work. Like my mother exposed me to composers like William Grant Still, Butterfly Lover's Violin Concerto. But actually in that protest chant itself, something I noticed a little later is harmonically, it actually fits into a pentatonic musical structure, which for folks who don't know, pentatonic music usually appears in a lot of East Asian structures, Chinese musical structures. But then rhythmically, there's syncopation, and there's also call and response, which are structures we find in Black and African diaspora music. So the protest music itself is almost a soundscape of solidarity building.
Wow. Okay.
And I wasn't even planning it. I was like, oh, snap, my brain.
Love that. And I think that sort of brings us to Htet. I love your music, and I was wondering if you could talk a little about how you started making music, but also specifically like what drew you to R&B as a genre.
Yeah. So growing up, like music had kind of always been in my life. You know, my grandfather was a musician in Burma. And you know, like being in a third world country, like it's hard to find things that you know that makes you happy, because you just keep hearing about all these like bad like political things, right? And music was kind of my way to like shut myself off from the world and everything around me. And you know, it's just that thing that made me happy, right? It was kind of just in my blood. And I loved listening to music. I loved writing music. So I had always written since I was really young, but I actually didn't make, you know, my first song until 2019. And it really took my friends to kind of push me to be like, hey, you should, like, this is good stuff. Like, you should definitely put this out to the world. And I think being like this small little Asian girl, I always felt a little like inferior, almost. This like inferiority complex. Is that a phrase? I don't know.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna do it. And then people seemed to like it. So that's pretty much how it started. In terms of like R&B, I think that's just what, you know, I was listening to a lot at the time that I was making more music. I grew up with a lot of R&B as well. So like in Burma, you know, we didn't have a lot. We had like rock, R&B, pop, right? There was like not much of EDM and stuff. So like Rihanna, Beyonce, obviously, Sade, like I just kind of grew up like listening to those people. So it kind of stuck with me, you know. since I was young. But I would actually love to, like after coming here, I moved to the States when I was 15 years old. That was about like 11 years ago. And after I got here, I was exposed to way more music, right? There's just so much more here. And I would love to make more like indie music and EDM music and kind of like spread out my music more. But yeah, R&B is kind of like my little go-to, you know.
Yeah, I think it's cool to see how for all of you, there's a way that music is like calling in these like, you know, different people and different like places we come from and like all sort of connecting all of us.
Yeah, music finds you. I feel like it's like you don't even, you know what I mean? Like it just comes to you.
And even like what you're saying about listening to Sade and Beyonce, like music is a way we all can connect without explicit permission. We can all connect in a way that almost like is almost subversive to colonization, right? When they try to regulate how we interpret, how we experience, how we define. And yet through music, we're able to find ourselves in spaces where it's like, we can almost like supersede those limitations and supersede those impositions, right?
We're able to make those affiliations despite kind of forces that are against coalition building.
Exactly.
It was like a glimpse into like the world that I didn't know. You know, like because in Burma we don't have a lot of African American people. Like I think I might have seen like a couple like African American people in Burma, but I didn't really know anybody personally until I got here. So that was like a little glimpse of it, the world, and I loved it. I loved music, you know.
Yeah, I feel like that really resonates with like sort of your research and bringing these sort of spaces together.
Yeah, no, certainly.
Yeah. I was also curious, Rohan, the term Blasian and sort of how you like, because like, you know, in this talk, this is called Afro-Asia beats, and there's so many like different parts of the Caribbean have different terms for like different kinds of racial mixings, right?
We do.
So I'm like curious how you come to like Blasian as like the way you sort of name.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Blasian as a term has kind of popped up in a lot of like US pop culture. I guess not too recently, but it definitely was a term that I felt at the time was politically of use. So the Blasian March started in 2020 during the pandemic, during the lockdown, kind of in the sort of decline of a lot of the major protests around the murder of George Floyd. And I felt that the term Blasian kind of fit in with the whole current political atmosphere. So here in New York, for folks who were not here, like there were just tons of protests every day, like thousands of people out everywhere, like wherever you walk, just like, oh, it's a protest. Okay, great. Which was like amazing just to see our country do that. Cause I mean, I've seen other countries, like when other countries are in protest, it's like a big deal. Whereas here it's like, oh, okay. But here in New York, you know, I was seeing all these other actions that were more specific to the more marginalized parts of communities. So like you would see the Black Women's March, you saw the Black Disabled Lives Matter marches, you would see the Stonewall protests, which were a weekly action for LGBT Black folks. And so for me, using Blasian as opposed to Black Asian or Afro-Asian, I felt made a bit more sense because it was also a way to almost like combine literally in like grammatical structures, combine the two together as opposed to like keeping them separate. I felt like that was pretty important to me because for myself being both Black and Asian, it's impossible to separate me, you know? So why should we separate our movements, right? Why should we segregate ourselves in our contest with, you know, colonization and supremacy? Yeah, I think that's kind of what it really was. It was almost like we need to find a way to carve space for all of these people, bring them all together, but also make sure that we are even in the name itself, not creating a structure of segregation. Yeah.
So I just came back from the American Studies Association conferences, and we were talking a lot about like, do we hyphenate Afro-Asian? Like, you know, like how do we even like make language like describe this, you know? And then I think sort of how when we talk about music, like a lot of times we'll talk about like sampling and the ways that like sampling of like Asian musics and like hip hop and stuff, right? Like to what extent do we like bring that in, and like to what extent does that call in like the people who make those samples, right? Like to what extent are Asian people like a part of hip hop history and hip hop culture and stuff? So I don't know, I'm curious about this sort of in context with your work, Christina, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely when it comes to understanding, you know, Afro-Asian or like Blasian, these questions of are they reinforcing separation between the two? Also, I've been kind of thinking more and more about the implications, especially of neoliberal conceptions of multiculturalism. And I know that like BJ Prashad has done this very famous, you know, argument against it, in that speaking of multiculturalism assumes that each culture has its own fixed kind of state of being, and that it is a singular homogenous kind of entity of its own. And so he proposed, you know, a polyculturalism in kind of opposition as something that would not reinforce those values, but instead kind of consider the ways in which things have, you know, slippages in between cultures, all kinds of exchanges. And thinking about that in musical terms, I think that especially working in ethnomusicology and with, you know, the history of ethnomusicology as being used for, you know, colonial tools and purposes, you have to kind of constantly reinterrogate what are you assuming about different musical elements, especially to what you kind of call as a culture's or like a cultural product, rather than an intercultural, for example, dialogue or exchange. And so thinking, for example, about, you know, like what does it mean for things to sound Asian or sound Asian American, or sound African American, sound Black, thinking about, you know, like if, for example, you assume that parallel fourths and fifths, you know, like that's like an Asian sound or like the so-called Oriental melody, right? I think that there are ways in which they can be used for subversion at times, for kind of parodying, which is an interesting kind of case example. But at the same time, again, we have to constantly, I think, reinterrogate what do we associate as a sound belonging to one entity or belonging to one culture.
Absolutely.
That's actually so interesting because so a producer of mine, he sent me a song that has like very like Afro beats kind of style. And then I, you know, like my initial response was I actually hesitated a little because I was like, should I be making like Afro music, like music with Afro beats? Like, is it appropriate for me to do something like this? So you saying that actually kind of like, you know, stuck a little like light bulb in my mind, like why shouldn't I be able to, like if I'm representing it, you know, in a respectful way, and if it's beautiful, then you know, why shouldn't it be okay? So that's cool that you actually brought that up.
Yeah, no, definitely. And what you were talking about with like, you know, building these connections without asking for permission, you know, that could apply obviously towards kind of white colonial gazes and white colonial powers. But sometimes, and I think the big question also is between you know,
cultures.
Yes, between cultures, is it appropriation? Is it appreciation? And whose permission are you overstepping? What does it mean, however, you know, like, does it mean you can't engage with, you know, a musical culture whatsoever because you don't have the singular authority presence or some spokesman to ask permission from? So those questions, I think, also become very tricky.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with that because, like, for me, like in my work, obviously I am both Black and Asian. So like, I don't need anyone's permission. These are my particular cultures I am using. But I definitely like hear that. Like, I definitely agree. Like, there's always this issue of like, especially when we are borrowing or using for different culture, it's always this question of, am I doing this out of like a true desire to show appreciation, or am I doing appropriation out of imitation of colonial structures? And apart from that, where is approval given?
Yeah.
You know, like I'm thinking of a couple of years ago, I went to this Korean rapper's concert. Her name is CL. And oh my God, I love her.
Awesome live.
She's so good live. And one of my friends who went, he got really upset because he was like, well, one, he's not Black, but disclaimer, but he also was like, you know, a lot of the music she's using, it's appropriation, like she can't be doing this. And for me, I actually really appreciated it because all of her backup dancers were Black, all of her musicians were Black. When she went into like reggae dance hall, she referenced specifically like feminist reggae icons. So I was like, oh, she did her research, she did the work. So to me, it's like, if we're borrowing from certain cultures, especially as people who have survived ethnomusicology, never again.
I get it.
You know, it definitely is like, we need to make sure that we're doing the research, the respect, we're making sure that at least when we're creating these spaces, the folks who are in the space are feeling represented. So like, especially in the Blasian March, like if we're gonna have a certain musician in the space, you know, they are using things that are respectful to their own culture and other cultures around us, right? So it's again, that constant discourse and dialogue, but I definitely think research has to be done, research and respect.
Yeah. I was gonna ask for you, like, as we're sort of talking about, because I think even for your own culture, there's a way that we can be like fetishizing of ourselves, and like especially as like like if we're like in America, right, or like you're a second generation, third generation, like whatever, like there can be like a weird relationship with like an ancestral homeland, right, and like sort of how we like are respectful of like our own culture is also like maybe a little tenuous at times, and like we want to be like honoring of it, and sort of how do we call in those things. But I'm curious for you about your music. Like, do you feel like, you know, you're telling like Burmese American story? Or you like,
gosh,
I know that's like
the thing is like, if like to be completely honest, I don't think so. Just because like I'm fully aware that I have been very lucky when I moved here. You know, like my transition was super easy for me to come to America. I've been super privileged. And I'm very aware of that. Like I knew English like before I came here. And so when I make my music, like say if I was to talk about like, you know, Burma and how like it's been so easy for me here, I feel like it would be misrepresenting like a whole like 99% of people who came here who were actually like who struggled to come here, because people weren't giving out visas very easily back then. Even now, like I can't even go back home right now because there's like a whole coup happening, but that's another story. So I try to keep that out of it just because I don't want to be disrespectful to the people who are actually struggling, which is most of the people, right? Most of Burmese people back at home, or most of the people who had actually migrated here. But, you know, I am proud to be making music that's different from like what they say is different from what they usually hear, because I think the sound is different. I'm like a little Americanized, blah, 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 you know, and it's different, right? And I think it could be a little refreshing to be like, we don't have to be so focused on how, for a lack of good, like better words, like being oppressed and, you know, the sadness and etc. And I'm just focused on being my own musician as an individual and making good music. And if they're proud of me, then I'm proud of myself for that too, you know. Yeah.
I love that.
Thank you.
You're telling the Htet story.
Exactly. It's, you know, like I don't think I have the right to be the voice of like every like Burmese person out there just because I just think I've been really lucky.
Yeah. I mean, and our cultures are so diverse. And I think like within it, right, there's so many different kinds of like musics that are coming out of all of our different sort of like all the countries we're from and everywhere. And like as we move, sounds change. Like there's definitely it's just like so multiplicitous. Yeah. I'm curious how, like, as you're talking about when you sort of go back to Japan and like see these music scenes again, you see it differently. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about how like researching in South Africa changed seeing Japan for you.
Right. Yes. I think that, well, a lot of it also has to do with just adulthood, you know, like I was a queer kid. And that means that my options are limited when it comes to the spaces I could occupy. Also, it was, you know, a while ago, which means that representation is also very different. I really think that Japan and its kind of public discourse around sexuality and gender especially has changed quite rapidly and drastically, really, in the past few years. And what I mean by that is mostly when it comes to kind of LGBTQ categorizations as well as self-identifications. A lot more reports governmentally are being done. There are a lot more spaces that are being held. Places that were considered to be kind of, you know, so-called like shady or like sexualized or seen as kind of underground have become, maybe for good and for worse, a lot more accessible. But what I also see at the same time, actually, perhaps because of my fieldwork in South Africa, is kind of a clearer understanding, although not a distinction, but an understanding that there are all kinds of different conceptions of gender and sexuality that are circulating and being contested. So what I mean by that is, you know, there are American discourses around lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc. And then there are some indigenous, or rather like local conceptions, Japanese historically based conceptions of gender sexuality, pre-modernization, pre-westernization, and even within that, all kinds of varieties. And renderings of what it means to be within some kind of homoerotic relationship, explicitly homosexual one, what it means to perform as another gender, for example, and what that kind of says about your own gender. Like, you know, kabuki is, you know, a very famous Japanese theatrical drama. But what we actually don't talk about as much, especially within Japanese discourse, is how much of it was actually kind of this play on gender because it was all men. And actually what a lot of people don't know about is that kabuki started out with all women. Yeah, so we actually have a kind of, I've observed that most Japanese musical practices actually always stemmed from an all-women situation, which is, you know, another story of its own. But because it was seen as kind of moral corruption by the government, they actually replaced them with young men. But then the same discourse came of that actually too. So the young men were also too sexual. So they changed it to older men, apparently. So, yeah, but anyway, like all these different histories are things that we actually don't discuss very much because I think that we see LGBTQ identities as something that has been imported. And I think that's something that I've really also seen in South Africa too, that a lot of people, queer identifying people, have been asserting, you know, their identities as something that is locally based, indigenously based, historically based. But a lot of the discourse around homosexuality there is that it is this like white Western kind of imperialist import, something enforced upon the African nation. So combating that and seeing the nuance in all of that, I think, is something that I'm grappling. Yeah.
There's something really similar in my home culture in Jamaica, where actually in our music, we also kind of view queerness as this Western white people thing, without any acknowledgement of queerness throughout African history. Throughout, we can go on bisexual kings and all those things. But I mean, even in our music, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of music that was specifically violent towards queer people.
Really?
Yeah, there was one song, I want to say early 2000s, by a fun group called TOK, and literally the song is about burning a gay man for a tire. And it's like a top chart, like #1 song in Jamaica for a very long time. So it's interesting that we're talking about how we view queerness as this Western other thing without acknowledging that we've been around since time immemorial. It's just the weird way we are now defining it is through a colonial lens. And I hope and I wish that folks begin to learn to make that distinction moving forward.
So I also want to make sure that for folks on the live stream and for anyone here, if you have questions, that we have time for those. So feel free to put questions in the chat, or if y'all want to raise your hands now. I'll take questions.
I have a question. So I have a friend who is a Japanese anthropologist, and she was talking about how there's I'm Korean, and so we were talking about protest culture in Japan and how there's not a lot of protest ever. And what she said was that in Japan, kind of what happens is that you have something that you don't like and you just keep it in. I was wondering how that manifests in music and what you've seen through that.
That's actually an excellent question, especially pertaining to this topic. So in terms of protest music, I mentioned post-war, but actually, so my grandfather, for example, he was part of the US-Japan Security Treaty protest. And that was basically protesting against the treaty being established because it went against the kind of wartime or post-war constitution that was built, that Japan would be a peaceful nation with no military intervention or no military of its own. But the treaty with the US security actually made it so that Japan would be militarized, just they can't declare war or go to war by themselves. They would have an allyship to the United States. And so with that protest happening, I believe in the 60s, and ending with mass kind of police brutality, murder of a lot of the students because they were, it was mostly student driven. I would say that historically, that's also when a lot of kind of protests became in many ways discouraged, seen as, not something that you can do. And also we have this saying in Japan, part of kind of, I can't really think of the etymology of it, but then it's called honne and tatemae. The honne is what you actually think, and the tatemae is what you kind of present instead, because you can't say. But this is a very old, actually, cultural kind of, also habitual, I think, convention that a lot of people think. And so I think that's an excellent question, because when it comes to, for example, Black musical practices, including jazz and blues early on, and now also with hip hop, etc. Idea. No, sorry. When it comes to these kind of practices, there is definitely a stereotyping, again, through the white colonial lens, that Blackness is connected somehow to more intense emotionality, for example, and affect. But at the same time, that actually has now been kind of an avenue for a lot of people in order to express their emotionality. And that's why you can actually see a lot of the protest music that has occurred has been employing a lot of rap, for example, call and response, hip hop. I think one of the more recent examples would be with the student movement called Shields or Sealeds. I think that was in protest of again, the US security treaty actually, and about militarization. So nothing has changed. It's gotten worse. But a lot of the kind of mass movement that was being gathered and that was, happening actually came from mobilization of call and response using hip hop and rap music. So do with that what you will, right? Because I think that that is in some ways appreciation, but also in some ways something that could have been extracted and kind of reappropriated without understanding the full extent or history of these musical practices and cultures. But that definitely is something that has occurred a lot when it comes to kind of Japanese feelings of having to repress and where music kind of comes in actually a lot of times in expressing that or addressing it. Yeah.
If there's feel free to raise your hand if you have questions. Yeah.
Wait, I gotta go. Yeah. Yeah, I'm really curious. Since you mentioned that you were classically trained, that was like a big foundation of your learning as a musician. Oh yeah.
Oh me. I was like, yes, yes, I'm here.
Just like how you use that skill, but are still able to get away from a Western European outlook on music, but to not be confined to that, but to still use your skills and write effectively and express yourself.
Well, if I'm interpreting your question correctly, you're asking me more about how even though I'm classically trained, and the dichotomy between that and using music as for a protest. Am I?
Yeah, or just more generally not getting locked into that. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
I see. Okay. Well, unfortunately, given the fact that I grew up in the West, I grew up in a Western civilization. I have very little choice in undoing that or working directly against that. The fact that I can analyze that protest music and say, oh, la, do, la, re, do is the solfege for that protest chant. Unfortunately, because I am trained in this capacity, I cannot escape it. However, I can use it to my advantage. I can say, even though these tools, these instrumentations of sound were imposed on me, I can still use that almost as a response to the way I've been oppressed through music. Because us both having degrees in ethnomusicology, historically speaking, it was called, correct me if I'm wrong, comparative musicology, where essentially these musicologists were looking at other genres and trying to prove through anthropology, quote unquote, how it was inferior to Western music. So even my degree in of itself is problematic. So unfortunately, I can't really escape it as much, and I understand that. But because we are all in this Western structure, that also makes the music more accessible to the people around us who have also grown up in this musical cultural structure. I hope that answered your question. Cool, amazing.
Yeah, I think there's something really all of us here are living within sort of more broadly, right? Living within our capitalist colonialist structures. And so the mode for us to we do our organizing in English and we're so limited by these things that we're given, but it means that we're always doing these subversive things. And I think being grad students too, right? Thinking about the ways that learning and studying can also be really important for social movements and can be a really important component because you have to know your histories and you have to understand and be able to think about sort of systems more broadly, right? And it's not the end of the sort of struggle, but I think there's something really powerful about being able to use these tools subversively too.
Yes. Right. It's using structures and tools to your advantage. It's using the system to beat the system, right? So we're creating a certain soundscape that does use what we interpret as these tones, these structures, these scales. Well, that's the way that we interpret these things. But because we can use these systems in a way that's imaginative, in a way that's creative, we can then present, one of my dear colleagues and friends on the West Coast, Soleil Yu, she uses this term called political imagination.
Yeah.
And I feel like using these tools, using these Western structures that we're stuck in, because we're stuck in these structures, we can then access other people or reach other people who are also stuck in these structures to help foster a new political imagination.
As you should.
As you should.
Yeah.
As you should.
Are there other questions? Or do y'all have questions for each other too? Like,
I think there was a question.
Oh,
I saw like two in the back. There's some over there.
I'm like, have a limited vision, but I don't know if Rohan can see you.
Tall people, can we see? I saw someone over there. If not, we'll just keep going.
Yeah.
What is this? I don't know if people online can hear me.
We'll like repeat it maybe.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
can repeat it.
I'm just curious about like, if anyone shared stories of like unexpected connections of like Afro-Asian music. Like obviously Asian is quite important with the representation across this field, but like is there anything like surprising, sort of unexpected connections?
Ooh. Unexpected connection, Black and Asian connections in music.
The emotion that it brings.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, go into that. Definitely go into
It
that.
doesn't matter. I feel like it doesn't matter what the sound is. Like when you hear the music, like, you know, whether it's made by an Asian person or a Blasian person or a Black person, like the emotion it brings out of you, it's very raw and very true. And it goes, it's an equal playing field in terms of the emotion it brings out of you. And I think that's my favorite part of music, right? Like it doesn't matter who's making it, and you know, like no matter the difference in sound, the emotion and the raw emotion that it evokes from people are always true and honest, right? And I think that's the connection that I can make for music. Yeah.
I guess for me, the universality of music as protest. I guess something that's I found very interesting, especially thinking about, as you mentioned, for hip hop as a genre of protest in Japan, but also going back to like, you know, the early roots of hip hop and how that was also a genre of protest. I mean, I think in some ways it still is, especially when it comes down to Black feminism. It's definitely a genre of protest, and Black female sexual liberation, of course, which I am like, yes. But I think for me, I think because there is a universality of protest within music, or how music is used universally as a method of protest, I've become very surprised at how people are now giving themselves more permission to supersede boundaries across racial lines. I think, for example, maybe for me, we had this year our first ever Los Angeles Blasian March, and that was also Black, Asian, Trans Solidarity Power Rally, and it was also one of the earlier times I actually heard Black people say Asian Lives Matter. I've heard that at multiple other Blasian marches. We heard that actually at our first rally. And then we had a rally in the winter of 2021. And that one was fascinating, since the Black people were completely erased from that moment of history, which I find very fascinating. For folks who don't know, we had a winter rally in 2021 to kind of like decry anti-Asian violence. This rally was specifically to center like Asian people and Asian diaspora folks. And even though the Blasian March was not like the main organization, we weren't like the major one, we were like the major contributor. We did all the press release, we did all the PR. coordinated a lot of the safety work. So we collaborated with a team of women of color to put that rally together. And like you heard Black people saying Asian Lives Matter, which of course, in many ways, especially in discourse, in sharing space, that's become a very controversial thing to say. But of course, I'm sitting here like, well, if a Black person says it, isn't there a suspension of boundaries? Isn't there a suspension of approval, disapproval, or whatever you want to say? And I find it really interesting that music or like the rhythms of protest chant was allowing people to really extend that kind of a political olive branch across boundaries. That really surprised me, yeah.
Yeah, I think I don't think this directly answers the question. I apologize, but because I think that what I have found are similarities, for example, or commonalities between, for example, Japanese music and South African music has usually been unsurprising in terms of kind of the American influence, for example, where it stems from, or kind of Western conceptualizations. And I'm also wary of trying not to do exactly what you have spoken with comparative, musicology of saying, of essentializing either to be like, oh, this is the same. But I can share something that was surprising about, for example, Asian American music making, actually, in that I didn't know taiko was this very kind of big and prominent, influential music making practice for a lot of Asian Americans beyond just Japanese American populations, especially because taiko, which means drum, in Japanese, is not something that is perceived the same way. We have drums as part of different musical cultures. But we don't have the same kind of like odaiko big drum, kodaiko small drum, an extremely kind of like gesticular, almost choreographic kind of practice that you do in the United States. And I think what also speaks to that actually is how this taiko is, again, kind of for community building and coalition within, this Pan-Asian, perhaps even kind of a movement. It's very much praxis based. And I think a lot of that is an influence from a lot of Black American organizing and social justice movements, especially considering regionally, coming mostly from California and the West Coast, and all of the kind of cultural and populative kind of interchange that goes between Black populations there and Asian American populations there. So that was something that was surprising for me. And I really come to appreciate. Yeah.
I think we're about out of time, but maybe if there's like one last question.
Nola, you have a question?
So I wanted to return for a second to your comment about like hearing Black people say Asian Lives Matter, because like I feel like I know the feeling that you're talking about. Like it's a relationship that I've also tried to navigate, and it feels really contentious sometimes.
Yeah.
Conversations about it. So I just sort of was wondering if like there were any other moments like that that you feel like have really given you hope about like that relationship.
Yeah.
A future of it, I guess.
Yeah. The question, if I'm understanding Nola correctly, is about if I could find other examples than just the usage of Asian Lives Matter as a term to create hope between communities and the blurring of community boundaries. And please feel free to jump in, any of you, on this one. I would like to say, yeah, I can think of a couple right now off the top of my head. I think one example would be our Chicago rally. I think it was also a moment where many people were able to learn or hear or experience all these different cultures in one space. We even had a Black Japanese dancer who he like did a whole mashup of like J-pop and like breaking, and it was just such a cool thing. And I was like, yes, why not? Oh my gosh, resistance is in both your bloods, honey. And I thought that was just so beautiful because now people were able to see the joy of blurring lines, the joy of radically abolishing the boundaries between communities of color that have been instilled and imposed on us by colonization, by white supremacy, by the colonial state. That's one example. And I loved it because the Chicago rally, I did very little of the organizing. I was like, thank you. It was locally organized. Kent Venturina is a student at Columbia College, and Young Kyung-chi is another organizer in Chicago, and they both like led the whole thing, and it was beautiful. I was like, I just showed up. I did the PR, I did the fundraising, and I showed up. That's great. Amazing. I think another example is pretty recently. So I was actually flown out to Switzerland to actually do some performance artwork at a anti-racist festival. And I actually, a couple of years ago, I actually choreographed a ballet solo called Homage. And it pays tribute to Asian Americans who have been killed by police. And the first iteration of it, we used an upright jazz bass as the musical accompaniment, and it was all iterations of Black jazz music. This time around was a little different. We still used an upright bass, and we used one piece called Haitian Fight Song. I am blanking on the composer for some odd reason, but that's okay. And after the piece was done, we had a whole talk back, and a lot of the organizers were very surprised. They had no idea that Asian Americans experience very extreme police violence. And after that, a lot of them wanted to build coalition that was cross-racial. And I was like, did I just witness the genesis of a cross-racial coalition? This is amazing. So it's giving me hope, knowing that it's art that's inspiring literally global movements, which I find really beautiful right now. Yeah.
Wow. I'm really glad we are like ending on this. No. Do y'all have any final like thoughts, comments?
I mean, for me, I'm just like so happy to be here and like hearing all of this, because I don't like I'm not very connected as an Asian American just because I came here not too long ago. So I'm actually not very like educated about these kind of things. So it's really amazing for me to be here and actually like learn all these things, and even like when people ask. So thank you for like having me on this panel, Maya, and I'm so glad to be in the presence of you two as well. So
check out Htet's music on all streaming platforms, right?
Yes.
Check out the Blasian March. Yeah. Christina's work, right?
As it comes.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We will be back December 8th. It is our final event, so it's gonna be a little party, and it's at New Year weekend, so it's gonna be a little party. And,
okay.
We'll see you in a month.
Great.